Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the pound dollar. It is September 28th, 2020. So we've got some ideas here that I want to talk about. Yesterday we talked about this one briefly on the Sunday special where I just talk about my technical analysis outlook for the week. But so far this week we've already had some really interesting things start to happen on the pound. So let's talk about some trading setups that I personally see a little bit more in detail on the pound this week. So again, we saw briefly yesterday on the video that I put out some ideas, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth. So let's talk about the pound here and why right now I am still bullish on GBP USD. Now there's a couple main factors here, and the big thing that I'm going to talk about is in fact the fact that this is trading against the US dollar. So when we have something like GBP USD, right, we are looking against the US dollar to gauge the pound, which is important because the US dollar recently has been on a very strong overall downtrend. Now recently we have had the dollar gain some value, right? You can actually see the pound coming down relatively, which means the opposite. So typically when the US dollar is coming down, the pound might be rising on this chart, right? And then vice versa. If the pound starts getting weak, the US dollar relatively would be considered stronger. So we have to think of these two in correlation, because when we are trading Forex, we are trading two currencies at any given time when we are using a currency pair. So what's been going on with the US dollar? Well, the US dollar and the US economy, just like a lot of the world right now, is under a lot of pressure. So when we look at the US dollar, we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of unemployment. We still have some really big damage due to the whole pandemic situation. So that's global though, because so does the pound, right? But the US dollar has printed a tremendous amount of money. They printed the most money by far around the world to try and ease the problems with this whole situation. So with that said, that has been a very bearish case for the US dollar in the last several months. So a lot of people have been very bearish, thinking that, okay, they're printing so much money, and what happens when you print a lot of money? Well, it devalues the currency, right? So if we actually, before we jump into the pound here, if we take a look at DXY, this is the US dollar index. And you can actually see that we have been on a rise here. We have broken from a downtrend. We talked about this recently. But the idea here is that long term, we still have to be aware that this 200 period moving average is still bearish. We still have a lot of reasoning for this long-term downtrend to potentially continue overall. Now, granted, we do have what looks like a pretty good technical bounce here. So I've actually highlighted my analysis from this morning. You can see here is some resistance that we've broken through. We also were in a downtrend using this trend line that got broken out. And now things are actually looking short-term bullish. So my opinion here is short-term bullish on the US dollar, but longer term, I still think things are bearish because we do have some serious problems with the ginormous printing of money. And then we can go take a look at the pound relatively and see, well, how could we potentially trade that? So again, looking at the US dollar specifically, the DXY, the US dollar index, right? We can see we have started to form a higher low. We've broken through some resistance. Things look to me short-term bullish here on the pound. Now, to keep that in perspective, if we do continue to bounce up, we've got some key resistance. Again, that 200 period moving average, but also we've got some technical zones that we can keep an eye on. Now, if you don't trade with the DXY or you don't look at it, I definitely think it's worth looking at because it does give you an overall picture of what the US dollar is doing. So if you trade things like USD CAD, USD Swiss, dollar yen, or pound dollar, euro dollar, Aussie dollar, right? Those relate to, or they depend on what the US dollar is going to be doing for part of their movement. So we want to keep an eye on the US dollar for any of those sort of crosses, in my opinion. So with that said, let's hop back over to GBP USD for a moment and we will see if we can talk about some trading setups. Now, again, one thing I want to point out that we talked about yesterday on the video was that we actually got a beautiful bounce, as we were hoping for, off of that 200-day moving average. Now that to me is very bullish and actually could be a good sign for the pound, and maybe even mean that the pound will actually still do all right even if the US dollar index does continue to move higher. So let's also highlight what we talked about yesterday just a bit, we can actually get this this same zone going that we talked about yesterday. So you can see this zone that we highlighted did in fact hold very nicely. In fact, yesterday we talked about a few major things here on this zone. So let me point them out and we'll get a recap of the technicals here. So we've got that resistance zone that now looks like it wants to hold as support. It has done so far. That is part number 1, okay? Part number 2 here that we talked about yesterday in the video was this 200-day moving average, which to me is a very bullish indication. If price can hold that or is trading above it, it's usually a bullish market. If things are underneath it, it is usually longer term bearish, right? So with that said, that's our second point, but there's also a third point here that I can draw in using a trend line. You can see we've got a nice little upward trend there on the pound. So to me, there's a lot of technical reasoning here for potential long opportunities. Now, so when we're looking at this, how do we actually take advantage of this? It seems like the train has already left the station, which I guess if you were looking for this particular setup, it sort of already has. There may be a retest, and that might be worth looking at for potential longs, but I am going to be using this a little bit shorter term. So if I'm looking for a break to the upside here, let's remember our analysis here on the daily chart, and let's go ahead and bring it down to something like the 1-hour chart. So this is a little bit shorter term than the daily chart, but the idea here is that, okay, we know that this zone and this trend line has held bullishly on the higher time frames. That could give us some nice structure to trade on those shorter time frames. So we know the higher time frame is doing, is looking pretty bullish at this zone, at least according to my own analysis, right? So if we were to use that information to our advantage and maybe look for opportunities to get long, we can start taking a look at some other technical factors, such as this one, where we've got this downward trend line. This is the a shorter term counter trend, right? Because we've got bears here on the shorter time frames, but on the longer time frames, we've got some bulls that may be ready to move this market. So with that said, we've used the higher time frame, and now maybe there's something like a break and retest setup that actually could have a little bit more steam, since we are trading off of those higher time frames and hoping that or not hoping, but we're strategizing that there's a pretty good chance that those higher time frames could follow through. We could see some bulls push this market higher. So how could we trade that? So now we've used the higher time frames, we've looked at the big picture, the macro, and potentially, or even considered some of the fundamentals, right? Then we've looked at the time frames that are higher, the daily chart, and you could even look at the 4-hour chart. And then bringing it down to those lower time frames if you want to execute shorter term trades. So that could lead us into something like this. And this is a trade setup that I personally like right now. So if we were to break above this level, right? If we were to get bullish and show some nice confirmation above, hold that level, the retest could actually be a nice opportunity, in my opinion, for the continuation, right? So break, retest, and go long. I like that setup personally with a managed risk, risking only 1% or so, 2% max in my own view, to potentially capture some of that upside. So that's one scenario of how I like to trade this. Now, I do want to also offer the counter idea if things were to change directions. So, and sometimes people give me a hard time in my videos. They say, oh, Nick, you just analyze both directions, so you're always right. But I could be wrong either way. It depends how you manage your trade, where you put your stop, how you execute the trade, if you decide to take it, that sort of thing. So I like to actually analyze both potential directions. So if we're wrong about this, if this higher time frame does not hold and we do in fact start breaking bearish, there might be some other ideas to consider on the pound. So we talked about this major zone right here, right, where we have supportive structure, we have the SMA, the 200 SMA, which to me is a significant longer term indicator of the trend, and we have this upward trend line. But if this breaks, if we do actually get a lot of US dollar strength, right, that could push the pound dollar lower, right? Because remember, we're trading the GBP USD. So if the US dollar gets very strong, that could leave the pound weak and push price lower. So in that case, there might actually be a flip side perspective to look at. So if price were to get bearish in this case, right, we could actually look for opportunities there as well. So if we were to break, for me, the big one being underneath that 200-day, close significantly under it, and break through this supportive structure and break through the trend line, right, there might be opportunities to look for retests to go short. Now that is not the current situation and not what I think is going to happen, but if it does start to happen, it would be worth adjusting to. So in that case, right, there might be a perspective of a short bias that could actually develop if we were to see the break of some of that structure. You know, maybe you put something above structure there, just as an example, right? And let's say we went for something like a 2 to 1. I actually like that a lot because it brings us down to kind of this structure area here, right? And that could actually be a decent setup as well if things started to get short. So if price came down underneath, if we broke through that bullish structure and then we see a retest there, I like the idea. That gives me a pretty decent risk to reward, looking for the downtrend to continue down to this level here. So that's the bearish side if things decide to get bearish, because we never know exactly what the market's going to do. All we can do is react accordingly and set up trades that give us a good risk to reward and let us potentially capture more upside than the downside that we set up. So that is my opinion there on the pound overall. Again, mostly bullish right now, but if things were to flip, I would be willing to start to look for setups on the bearish side. I don't like to commit 100% to one direction. I like to go with the flow, go with the momentum of what the market is actually doing, rather than try and force my will on the market, if you will. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you got something out of it. Make sure to like the video down below and subscribe to the channel. If you aren't already a member of the A1 trading community, check out the description down below if you want to come trade with myself and the rest of my team and the other analysts there. So thanks so much. We'll see you back in the next video.